Welcome to Docket Decoder. If you enjoy our content, please do us a favor and hit that like button or subscribe so you can stay up to date with the latest court filings. United States Department of Justice Interim Policy Forensic, Genetic, Genealogical, DNA Analysis, and Searching. 1. Purpose and Scope. The purpose of this interim policy is to promote the reasoned exercise of investigative, scientific, and prosecutorial discretion in cases that involve forensic, genetic, genealogical, DNA analysis, and searching. It provides guidance to department agencies when formulating a thoughtful and collaborative approach to important interdisciplinary decisions in cases that utilize this investigative technique. Collaboration between investigators, laboratory personnel, and prosecutors is important because the decision to pursue FGGS may affect privacy interests, the consumption of forensic samples, and law enforcement's ability to solve violent crime. The department must use FGGS in a manner consistent with the requirements and protections of the Constitution and other legal authorities. Moreover, the department must handle information and data derived from FGGS in accordance with applicable laws, regulations, policies, and procedures. When using new technologies like FGGS, the department is committed to developing practices that protect reasonable interests in privacy while allowing law enforcement to make effective use of FGGS to help identify violent criminals, exonerate innocent suspects, and ensure the fair and impartial administration of justice to all Americans. The department will continue to assess its investigative tools and techniques to ensure that its policies and practices properly reflect its law enforcement mission and its commitment to respect individual privacy and civil liberties. This interim policy establishes general principles for use of FGGS by department components during criminal investigations and in other circumstances that involve department resources, interests, and equities. The scope of this interim policy is limited to the requirements set forth herein. It does not control investigative, scientific, or prosecutorial activities or decisions not specifically addressed. The department's individual law enforcement components may issue additional guidance that is consistent with the provisions of this interim policy. 2. Application. This interim policy applies to 1. All criminal investigations in which an investigative agency in the Department of Justice has exclusive or concurrent jurisdiction of the crime under investigation, and the agency has lawful custody, control, or authority to use a forensic sample for FGG/FGGS. Or 2. Any criminal investigations in which the department provides funding to a federal, state, local, or tribal agency to conduct FGG/FGGS. Or 3. Any criminal investigation in which the department employees or contractors conduct genealogical research on leads generated through the use of FGGS. Or 4. Any federal agency or any unit of state, local, or tribal government that receives grant award funding from the department that is used to conduct FGG/FGGS. 3. Background. A. STR DNA typing and CODIS. Forensic DNA typing has historically been used to compare 13 to 20 STR DNA markers between a forensic sample and one or more reference samples. When a suspect's identity is unknown, a participating crime laboratory may upload a forensic profile into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS. CODIS is a law enforcement database that compares DNA profiles derived from forensic samples to those of known offenders. CODIS was created by the DNA Identification Act of 1994. This legislation authorized the FBI to create and maintain a national database comprised of designated DNA indices that are routinely searched against one another. If a CODIS search results in a confirmed match between a forensic profile and a known offender, a law enforcement lead is generated and the name of the matching offender is released. If the search does not result in a confirmed match, no lead is generated. B. Forensic, genetic, genealogical, DNA analysis and searching. Forensic genealogy is law enforcement's use of DNA analysis combined with traditional genealogy research to generate investigative leads for unsolved violent crimes. Forensic, genetic, genealogical DNA analysis differs from STR DNA typing in both the type of technology employed and the nature of the databases utilized. FGG examines more than 500,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms, which replaced the STR DNA markers analyzed in traditional forensic DNA typing. These SNPs span the entirety of the human genome. This allows scientists to identify shared blocks of DNA between a forensic sample and the sample donor's potential relatives. Recombination or reshuffling of the genome is expected, as DNA from each generation is passed down, resulting in larger shared blocks of identical DNA between closer relatives and shorter blocks between more distant relatives. Due to predicted levels of recombination between generations, it is possible to analyze these blocks of genetic information and make inferences regarding potential familial relationships. Department laboratories currently do not analyze SNP during forensic DNA casework. Thus, in appropriate cases, it is necessary to outsource biological material to vendor laboratories that perform FGG. After a forensic or reference sample is genotyped by a vendor laboratory, the resulting FGG profile is entered into one or more publicly available open data personal genomic DNA databases or direct-to-consumer genetic genealogy services. The FGG profile is then compared by automation against genetic profiles of individuals who have voluntarily submitted their biological samples or entered their genetic profiles into these GG services. A computer algorithm is used to evaluate potential familial relationships between the forensic or reference sample donor and the service users. It is important to note that personal genetic information is not transferred, retrieved, or downloaded, or retained by GG service users, including law enforcement, during the automated search and comparison process. In addition, the investigative use of FGGS involves different DNA technologies, genetic markers, algorithms, and databases from those used by CODIS. Information and data derived from FGGS is not and cannot be uploaded, searched, or retained in any CODIS DNA index. 4. Limitations. If the search of an FGG profile results in one or more genetic associations, the GG service typically generates and provides the service user with a list of genetically associated service usernames along with an estimated relationship, and in some cases, the amount of DNA shared by those individuals. A genetic association means that the donor of the forensic or reference sample may be related to a service user. However, information derived from genetic associations is used by law enforcement only as an investigative lead. Traditional genealogy research and other investigative work is needed to determine the true nature of any genetic association. A suspect shall not be arrested based solely on a genetic association generated by a GG service. If a suspect is identified after a genetic association has occurred, STR DNA typing must be performed, and the suspect's STR DNA profile must be directly compared to the forensic profile previously uploaded to CODIS. This comparison is necessary to confirm that the forensic sample could have originated from the suspect. 5. Case criteria. Investigative agencies may initiate the process of considering the use of FGGS when a case involves an unsolved violent crime and the candidate forensic sample is from a putative perpetrator, or when a case involves what is reasonably believed by investigators to be the unidentified remains of a suspected homicide victim. In addition, the prosecutor, as defined in footnote 20 of this interim policy, may authorize the use of investigative FGGS for violent crimes or attempts to commit violent crimes other than homicide or sexual offenses, while observing and complying with all requirements of this interim policy, when the circumstances surrounding the criminal acts present a substantial and ongoing threat to public safety or national security. Before an investigative agency may attempt to use FGGS, the forensic profile derived from the candidate's forensic sample must have been uploaded to CODIS, and subsequent CODIS searches must have failed to produce a probative and confirmed DNA match. The investigative agency with jurisdiction of either the crime or the location where the unidentified human remains were discovered must have pursued reasonable investigative leads to solve the case or to identify the unidentified human remains. Finally, when applicable, relevant case information must have been entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System and the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program National Database. 6. Investigative collaboration. If each of the criteria set forth in Section 5 has been satisfied, The investigative agency shall contact a designated official at the CODIS laboratory that uploaded the forensic profile to CODIS. The DLO must determine if the candidate forensic sample is from a single source contributor or is a deduced mixture. The DLO will also assess the candidate forensic sample's suitability, example, quantity, quality, degradation, mixture status, etc., for FGG and advise the investigative agency about the results of that evaluation. In addition, the DLO may advise the investigative agency of any reasonable scientific alternatives to FGGS, given the nature and condition of the candidate forensic sample and the availability of other DNA technologies or techniques. The investigative agency shall document its consultation with the DLO. After consulting with the DLO, the investigative agency shall contact the prosecutor. The investigative agency shall advise the prosecutor of the nature and status of the investigation, the results of the DLO's evaluation of the candidate forensic sample, and any reasonable scientific alternatives to FGGS provided by the DLO. After discussing these issues, and based on the information provided, the prosecutor and the investigative agency must agree that the candidate forensic sample is suitable for FGG and that FGGS is necessary and an appropriate step at that stage of the investigation to develop investigative leads or to identify the unidentified human remains. If agreement is reached on these points, FGGS may proceed. 7. Investigative caution. Investigative agencies shall identify themselves as law enforcement to GG services and enter and search FGG profiles only in those GG services that provide explicit notice to their service users and the public that law enforcement may use their service sites to investigate crimes or to identify unidentified human remains. The investigative agency shall, if possible, configure service site user settings that control access to FGG profile data and associated account information in a manner that will prevent it from being viewed by other service users. In certain cases, the genetic association of an FGG profile with a GG service user, in conjunction with subsequent genealogy research, may identify one or more third parties who have a closer kinship relationship to the donor of the forensic sample than the associated GG service user. In such cases, the acquisition of a reference sample from those third parties for the purpose of conducting FGGS may help the investigative agency identify the donor of the forensic sample. An investigative agency must seek informed consent from third parties before collecting reference samples that will be used for FGGS, unless it concludes that case-specific circumstances provide reasonable grounds to believe that this request would compromise the integrity of the investigation. If that determination is made, the investigative agency shall consult with and receive approval from the prosecutor before covertly collecting any reference samples that will be used for FGGS. The investigative agency shall also consult with the DLO, who may provide guidance to investigators about the type and nature of biological samples that would prove most conducive to FGG analysis. Covert collection shall be conducted in a lawful manner. In addition, a search warrant shall be obtained by the investigative agency before a vendor laboratory conducts FGG analysis on any covertly collected reference sample. 7. Investigative caution. Investigative agencies shall identify themselves as law enforcement to GG services and enter and search FGG profiles only in those GG services that provide explicit notice to their service users and the public that law enforcement may use their service sites to investigate crimes or to identify unidentified human remains. The investigative agency shall, if possible, configure service site user settings that control access to FGG profile data and associated account information in a manner that will prevent it from being viewed by other service users. In certain cases, the genetic association of an FGG profile with a GG service user, in conjunction with subsequent genealogy research, may identify one or more third parties who may have a closer kinship relationship to the donor of the forensic sample than the associated GG service user. In such cases, the acquisition of reference samples from these third parties for the purpose of conducting FGGS may help the investigative agency identify the donor of the forensic sample. An investigative agency must seek informed consent from the third parties before collecting the reference samples that will be used for FGGS, unless it concludes that case-specific circumstances provide reasonable grounds to believe that this request would compromise the integrity of the investigation. If that determination is made, the investigative agency shall consult with and receive approval from the prosecutor before covertly collecting any reference samples that will be used for FGGS. The investigative agency shall also consult with the DLO, who may provide guidance to investigators about the type and nature of biological samples that may prove most conducive to FGG analysis. Covert collection shall be conducted in a lawful manner. In addition, a search warrant shall be obtained by the investigative agency before a vendor laboratory conducts FGG analysis on any covertly collected reference sample. Investigative agencies shall use biological samples and FGG profiles only for law enforcement identification purposes, and shall take all reasonable and necessary steps and precautions to ensure that same limited use by others who have authorized access to those samples and profiles. Biological samples and FGG profiles shall not be used by investigative agencies, vendor laboratories, GG services, or others to determine the sample donor's genetic predisposition for disease or any other medical or psychological trait. FGGS is law enforcement's technique used to generate investigative leads. Investigative agencies shall not arrest a suspect based solely on association generated by a GG service. Traditional genealogy research and other investigative work is required to determine the true nature of any genetic association. 8. Sample and data control and disposition. All FGG profiles and GG service account information and data shall be treated as confidential government information consistent with any applicable laws, regulations, policies, and procedures. These materials are subject to transfer and disclosure by department employees and contractors only during the discharge of their official duties and only for authorized purposes. If a suspect is arrested and charged with a criminal offense while FGG is in progress, the investigative agency shall promptly contact the relevant vendor laboratory or DTC service and direct that all testing cease at a point in time when the forensic or reference sample can be preserved. The investigative agency shall also request that the sample, extract, and amplicon be returned directly to the submitting law enforcement agency or custodial CODIS laboratory, as applicable. The investigative agency shall document its request and compliance by the vendor laboratory or DTC service. If a suspect is arrested and charged with a criminal offense after an FGG profile has been entered into one or more DTC services, the investigative agency shall make a prompt formal request that all FGG profiles and associated account information and data held by any such service be removed from its records and provided directly to the investigative agency. The investigative agency shall document its request and compliance by the DTC service. All FGG profiles, account information, and data shall be retained by the investigative agency for potential use during prosecution and subsequent judicial proceedings. If a suspect is arrested and charged with a criminal offense after an FGG profile has been entered into the Open Data Personal Genomics DNA database, the investigative agency shall promptly remove the FGG profile and all associated account information and data from the database. The investigative agency shall document the removal of this information and data. It shall be retained by the investigative agency for the potential use during prosecution and subsequent judicial proceedings. Subject to applicable law, in all cases that result in criminal prosecution, reference samples obtained from third parties for FGGS, including all extracts and amplicon, all derivative FGG profiles, and all GG service account information and data shall be destroyed by the investigative agency only after the entry of an appropriate judicial order. The investigative agency shall document the authorized destruction of these samples, profiles, information, and data. Subject to applicable government information retention schedules, if FGGS does not result in an arrest and the filing of criminal charges, the investigative agency shall promptly destroy all third-party reference samples, including all extracts and amplicon, all derivative FGG profiles, and all GG service account information and data after their investigative use is complete. The investigative agency shall document the destruction of these samples, profiles, information, and data. 9. Collection of FGGS metrics. Each department component that either uses or funds another agency to use FGG/FGGS for criminal investigative purposes, or that provides any unit of federal, state, local, or tribal government with grant award funding that is used by grantee to conduct FGG/FGGS for criminal investigative purposes, shall collect and retain the following information on an annual basis. 1. The type of crime investigated. 2. Whether FGG/FGGS was conducted on a forensic sample or a reference sample. 3. The type of forensic sample subjected to FGG and a description of the total amount, condition, and concentration of that sample. 4. Whether FGG analysis resulted in a searchable profile. 5. The identity of the vendor laboratory used to conduct FGG and the GG services used to search the FGG profile. 6. Whether the investigation resulted in an arrest that was based in part on the use of FGGS. And 7. The total amount of federal funding used to conduct FGG/FGGS in each case.